5:19 in the morning. The English Channel is the color of gunmetal, and the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc rise 100 feet straight out of the water, like a wall built by something that never intended for men to climb it. On top of that wall, German soldiers of the 726th Grenadier Regiment are watching the horizon fill with ships. Hundreds of them. A forest of steel appearing out of the mist as if the ocean itself had grown masts overnight. Somewhere below, in the cold and the dark, 225 American Rangers are climbing down rope nets into small wooden boats, and not one of them believes he is coming back. The Germans are not worried about the sea approach. They have looked at this cliff for 2 years. They have measured its angle, studied its rock, and reached the same conclusion every military planner on the Allied side privately feared was true. One German assessment of the position, filed months before the invasion, put it plainly: no army climbs stone that steep under fire and lives to tell of it. The guns are safe because the cliff does the killing before a single shell is needed. They were wrong. And the story of exactly how wrong they were is one that Hollywood has told in fragments, that history books have reduced to a single dramatic image of ropes and ladders, but that the German soldiers who lived through it described in far more haunting terms. This is not simply the story of a cliff. It is the story of what happens when the side certain of victory watches the impossible happen anyway, in real time, from 20 feet away, with nothing they can do to stop it. To understand what took place on this narrow stretch of Normandy coastline, you first have to understand what was sitting on top of it. 6 French-made howitzers, 155 millimeters each, captured decades earlier and repurposed by the German army into the most dangerous artillery position on the entire invasion coast. Their range was over 20,000 yards, nearly 12 miles, enough to reach both Utah Beach to the west and Omaha Beach to the east at the same time. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself had overseen the hardening of the Atlantic Wall, and Pointe du Hoc was one of its crown jewels, a position so obviously vital that Allied intelligence had marked it as the single most dangerous battery in the invasion zone months before a single soldier set foot on the sand. The Germans defending it were not fools, and they were not the tired garrison troops manning quieter stretches of coastline. Alongside the artillerymen of the coastal battery stood infantry from the 726th Grenadier Regiment, reinforced by elements of the 352nd Infantry Division, a unit that had recently rotated in from the Eastern Front and knew, better than most, what modern combined arms warfare actually looked like. These were men who had learned, through hard experience, that Allied naval gunfire was a weapon unlike anything they had faced before. And they had trained specifically for this stretch of coast, running rehearsals for an amphibious assault they were certain would come. What they had not rehearsed, what no one on their side had even considered plausible, was an assault that arrived not across the beach in front of them, but up the sheer rock face they had turned their backs to. That confidence in the cliff was not arrogance, it was geometry. A vertical rise of 100 feet, loose chalk and clay crumbling under any hand or boot that tried it, no natural path, no easy grade, nothing but open exposure the entire way up, while defenders stood at the top with clear lines of fire straight down. A machine gunner posted above the eastern face said it without embellishment in a report filed that spring. Anyone attempting to climb this position by hand will be dead before reaching the halfway point, and we will not need to waste ammunition confirming it. The man tasked with proving that assessment wrong had spent over a year preparing for exactly this moment. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder commanded the 2nd Ranger Battalion, activated barely a year earlier at Camp Forest in Tennessee from volunteers who had no idea, when they signed up, that their war would begin by climbing a cliff by hand, while men shot at them from above. Rudder trained them without mercy, first in Tennessee, then in Florida, and finally on the coast of Scotland, where cliffs nearly identical to Pointe du Hoc gave his men something to practice on besides imagination. One young lieutenant, George Kirchner, remembered the intensity of it plainly. They told us nothing was impossible. Our training was of a rare intensity, but underneath it all, we knew exactly why we were being prepared this way. 2 names would matter more than any others once the climbing started. First Sergeant Leonard Lomwell of Dog Company, a soft-spoken law student from New Jersey, who would end that day as one of the most consequential non-commissioned officers of the entire invasion, though almost nobody outside his unit would know his name for decades. And Sergeant Jack Kuhn, who would stand beside him at the exact moment history pivoted on a dirt farm road most maps didn't even bother naming. When Lieutenant General Omar Bradley briefed Rudder on the mission months earlier, even Bradley could barely believe what he was asking. He later wrote in his memoir that no soldier under his command had ever been given a harder task than the one handed to this 34-year-old officer and his men. And one intelligence officer on the staff supporting the landing was even blunter about the odds, telling colleagues that 3 old women armed with brooms could keep the Rangers from ever reaching the top of that cliff. Allied planners were so certain of catastrophic losses that body bags were prepared in advance for the majority of the assault force. Officially, headquarters projected casualties above 70%. The plan called for naval bombardment to soften the position, followed by a landing directly at the base of the cliffs, followed by an assault using rocket-propelled grappling hooks trailing rope, alongside extension ladders borrowed, almost unbelievably, from the London Fire Brigade. It was audacious to the point of sounding invented. It was not invented. It was simply the only plan anyone could devise for reaching guns that overlooked 2 entire invasion beaches from a position no one had ever successfully attacked from the sea. At 5:50 in the morning, the naval bombardment began. The battleship Texas and the destroyer Satterlee opened fire alongside the British ship Talybont, followed by a wave of Marauder bombers dropping their loads across the point. From below, in the landing craft, the Rangers watched the entire headland disappear into smoke and fire, an apocalyptic curtain that gave some of them a brief false hope that nothing up there could possibly have survived. Then the currents and the smoke did what currents and smoke do to a tightly timed operation. The boats drifted east, toward the wrong point of land entirely, and Rudder had to correct course under fire, costing his force nearly 40 critical minutes. Those 40 minutes gave the German defenders, dazed but alive beneath the pounding, just enough time to crawl back to their weapons before the boats ever reached the beach. The bombardment stopped at 6:25, timed to the original schedule. The Rangers did not arrive until 7:10. For 45 minutes, the cliff sat in silence, waiting, while German soldiers who had survived the bombing climbed back into position with machine guns and crates of grenades, watching the water for the boats they now knew, with total certainty, were coming. When the ramps finally dropped, the Rangers ran into water over their heads in some places, dragging equipment soaked through and heavier than it had any right to be, while German defenders opened fire from directly above. A weapon the Rangers would come to fear more than almost anything else in the war opened up first. A rapid-firing machine gun capable of well over 1,000 rounds a minute, so fast that individual shots blurred into a single continuous shriek the Americans nicknamed Hitler's Zipper. One Ranger later said he thought he was watching pebbles kick up around his boots. They were not pebbles. They were bullets striking the gravel inches from his feet, fired faster than the human ear could separate into individual shots. Along the cliff edge above them, a German infantry officer of the 726th Regiment watched the beach fill with running men and later described the scene to a superior in blunt, almost disbelieving terms. They are running straight at the base of the cliff with rope and iron hooks, as if the rock itself means nothing to them. We have never trained for this. Nobody trains for this. The Rangers began firing rocket-propelled grapnels up the rock face, trailing wet rope that grew heavier with every foot of seawater it had absorbed, some of the ropes falling short, some snapping under the strain, some catching perfectly on the crumbling earth at the summit. Where the ropes held, men began to climb hand over hand, using the crumbling chalk itself for handholds when the ropes gave out. German soldiers leaned over the edge and began cutting the ropes they could reach, and throwing German hand grenades, nicknamed potato mashers by American troops for their long wooden handles, down onto the men below. First Sergeant Leonard Lamel was climbing when the ground itself started coming apart beneath his hands. The cliff face crumbling in sheets under the weight of each new foothold, and he could hear the sound of loose rock sliding away into nothing every time he reached for the next grip. Below him, Sergeant Robert Fruehling, a radio operator, ran out of strength just short of the top and called out that he could not make it another inch. Lamel could not physically reach him. He shouted the only thing he could offer under fire. "Hold on, I can't help you," and instead called forward another ranger, Leonard Rubin, a powerfully built soldier who reached down, seized Fruehling by the collar, and hauled him bodily over the summit in a single violent motion, while bullets cracked past both of them. It was not the last time that day one ranger's strength would be the only thing standing between a comrade and a fall no one would survive. Private First Class Otto Stevens found a narrow break in the rock face where no rope had been fired at all, and climbed it using nothing but his combat knife, driving the blade into the crumbling chalk to carve handholds one at a time, while German fire raked the cliff around him. He reached the top alone, secured a line, and within minutes had opened a second route for the men behind him. The entire ascent, from the base of a cliff German engineers had certified as unclimbable under fire, took the first Rangers under 30 minutes. At the top, the fighting did not stop. It changed shape entirely. The Rangers who reached the summit found themselves inside a maze of overlapping bomb craters, concrete casemates, and connecting trenches, fighting room to room and crater to crater against defenders who knew every inch of the ground because they had built it themselves. A German gunner manning the anti-aircraft position on the western flank, one of the last positions to fall, described the fighting there afterward in a report that survived the war. They came out of the smoke like men already dead, and it did not seem to matter how many of them we hit. There were always more climbing over the edge behind them. And then came the moment that should have been the mission's triumphant climax, and instead became its strangest twist. Small groups of Rangers, moving fast and without waiting for stragglers still on the ropes, reached the casemates where the 6 great guns were supposed to be waiting. The casemates were empty. In their place stood telephone poles, painted and positioned to look like gun barrels from a distance, a decoy so effective that Allied aerial reconnaissance had been fooled for weeks. Weeks earlier, anticipating exactly this kind of bombardment, the Germans had quietly moved the real guns south, into an orchard, away from the cliff entirely, and left the dummy position to absorb the bombs. For men who had just crossed open beach under fire, climbed 100 feet of collapsing rock by hand, and fought through a warren of trenches to reach this exact spot, finding wooden poles instead of steel barrels could have broken the entire mission. It did not. First Sergeant Lommel and Sergeant Kuhn, acting entirely on their own initiative with no orders and no time to seek any, noticed tire tracks leading away from the empty casemates into the countryside beyond, and decided to follow them rather than report the guns missing and wait for instructions. It is a decision military historians still point to as one of the single most consequential independent actions taken by non-commissioned officers in the entire war. They moved south along a sunken farm road, alone deep inside territory that was still, functionally, entirely controlled by the German army, and found the 6 howitzers sitting in an orchard, camouflaged under netting, completely unguarded except for a small group of German soldiers gathered nearby. Seemingly unaware that the position had already been overrun a mile behind them, Lommel had no explosives large enough for the job. What he had were thermite grenades, small incendiary charges meant to be dropped into breech mechanisms to fuse them permanently shut. While Kuhn kept watch with his rifle, Lommel moved from gun to gun, dropping a grenade into each one, destroying the firing mechanisms of 5 guns in a matter of minutes before running out of thermite. He sprinted back toward the Ranger position, borrowed more explosive charges from another patrol, and returned to finish the 6th. By roughly 9 o'clock that morning, the battery that had been designed to reach across 2 invasion beaches with high explosive shells for the entire duration of the landing had been permanently silenced, without a single artillery duel, without a single naval shell landing anywhere near the actual guns, by 2 American sergeants, working almost entirely alone, with grenades never designed for destroying artillery in the first place. The German High Command did not yet know their most dangerous coastal battery was gone. What they did know, within hours, was that a force of American soldiers had somehow taken the top of a cliff their own engineers had certified could not be taken, and that realization triggered something close to fury. Reinforcements were ordered forward immediately. Elements of the 916th and 914th Infantry Regiments converging on the point from inland, tasked with retaking a position that, from a purely tactical standpoint, should never have fallen in the first place. What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a siege, and one the Rangers were catastrophically unprepared to sustain. Rudder's original plan had called for reinforcement from the main invasion force landing at Omaha Beach within hours. That reinforcement never arrived on schedule, because the landing at Omaha itself had gone badly wrong, pinned down on the sand by exactly the kind of coordinated defense the Germans had spent years preparing. By afternoon, Rudder radioed a message that would later be etched into military history for its restraint under catastrophic circumstances. Located Pointe du Hoc, mission accomplished, need ammunition and reinforcements, many casualties. The reply came back within the hour, and it contained no comfort at all. No reinforcements possible. All Rangers have landed at Omaha. 225 men had taken the point. By the following morning, fewer than 100 remained combat effective. They held a defensive perimeter barely 200 yards wide, surrounded on 3 sides, out of food, running desperately low on ammunition, and absorbing German counterattacks that came, methodically, again and again, through the night. To understand why the German response was so immediate and so relentless, you have to understand what this position represented to them, strategically, not just tactically. Pointe du Hoc was not simply an artillery battery. It was the hinge between 2 invasion beaches, a piece of high ground that, if held by the Americans, exposed the flank of every German unit trying to move reinforcements along the coastal road. Losing it permanently did not just cost them 6 guns. It severed a critical artery of their entire coastal defense network. From the German perspective, retaking the point was not optional. It was existential. That night, the counterattacks came from multiple directions at once. Infantry from the 726th Regiment pressing from the south, elements of the 914th pushing along the coastal road from the west, testing the thinning American perimeter for any gap wide enough to exploit. Around 3 in the morning, the western flank, held by a badly depleted company, was overrun entirely. 20 Rangers under Sergeant Leonard Petty made the decision to stay behind and hold the position as long as physically possible, buying time for roughly 50 of their comrades to fall back to a more defensible line. Nearly all 20 were captured. Some did not survive the attempt. A German company commander involved in that night's fighting later described the resistance in terms that carried, even decades on, a note of genuine bewilderment. We pushed them back 100 meters, and it cost us more men than taking the entire beach at Omaha had cost the division that morning. They fought like men who had already decided they were dead, and simply wanted to take as many of us with them as possible. Through the second day, the survivors held on. Their food gone, their ammunition rationed, round by round, treating their wounded with what little medical supplies remained, and waiting for a relief force that seemed, with every passing hour, less and less likely to arrive at all. Naval gunfire from the destroyers offshore provided the only reliable support they had left, breaking up German formations forming for fresh assaults whenever the Rangers could get a message through identifying targets. It was, in the most literal sense possible, all that stood between the survivors and annihilation. Not far away, other Rangers were fighting their own desperate battle to reach them. The 5th Ranger Battalion, diverted to Omaha Beach when the signal flare confirming a successful landing at the point had never been seen through the smoke, spent 2 days fighting through German positions along the coastal road, a journey that should have taken hours and instead took nearly 3 full days of continuous combat. When elements of that relief force finally broke through on the morning of the 8th of June, they found a defensive position held together by fewer than 100 exhausted men, many of them wounded, all of them nearly out of everything except the will to keep holding the line. In the 2 days of fighting, the 2nd Ranger Battalion suffered casualties exceeding 60% of its original strength. Of the 225 men who had landed at the base of that cliff, roughly 90 remained standing when relief finally arrived, a number that, when it reached Allied headquarters, was treated less as a casualty report and more as confirmation that the mission had, against every reasonable expectation, actually succeeded. The German soldiers who fought against them, and in many cases surrendered to them, left behind an accounting of the engagement that reads less like a battle report and more like an admission. A defending officer captured during the final clearing of the position offered an assessment that a debriefing officer later recorded almost word for word. We were told the cliff made this position unnecessary to defend from the sea. We were told wrong, and we paid for that mistake with the position itself. What happened at Pointe du Hoc did not end on the 8th of June. It simply changed form, becoming something closer to erasure than history. The mission's actual centerpiece, the systematic destruction of a battery capable of reaching 2 invasion beaches simultaneously, accomplished by 2 sergeants acting on their own judgment with improvised explosives, received almost no attention in the immediate post-war accounting of the invasion. Popular retellings preferred the more cinematic image, the ropes, the ladders, the cliff itself, over the quieter and arguably more decisive story of Lommel and Kuhn, walking alone down a farm road into territory still held by the enemy. Even the era's most famous cinematic depiction of the landings compressed the entire operation into a handful of minutes, more symbol than substance. It would take 4 decades, and a president standing on that same cliff top in 1984, to restore the story to something resembling its true scale. Speaking to a small gathering of the surviving Rangers themselves, President Ronald Reagan called them the boys of Pointe du Hoc, the men who took the cliffs, the champions who helped free a continent. It remains one of the most quoted speeches ever delivered on that stretch of French coastline, and it exists specifically because, without it, an entire generation might never have learned what those 225 men actually accomplished there. The guns Rudder's Rangers silenced never fired a single shell at either invasion beach, not one. In a war measured in the millions of tons of ordnance exchanged across a continent, the absence of 6 specific artillery pieces on one specific morning is a strange thing to call decisive. But every officer who understood what those guns could reach, every planner who had marked Pointe du Hoc as the single most dangerous position on the entire invasion coastline, understood exactly what that silence was worth. It was worth every American life that did not end on a beach within range of guns that never spoke. There is a particular kind of respect that only comes from an enemy who watched something happen and still cannot fully explain how. Not admiration born of propaganda, and not the polite fiction nations tell about their former adversaries after the fighting stops, but the specific, grudging astonishment of soldiers whose entire professional judgment told them a thing was impossible, delivered by men who then watched it happen anyway, 20 feet in front of them, with nothing they could do to prevent it. That is what the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc produced in the German soldiers who defended them. Not defeat alone, but the far more disorienting experience of watching their own certainty collapse in real time. The cliff is still there. Visitors who walk it today can still see the shattered concrete of the observation bunkers, the deep bomb craters that have never fully healed over an 80 years of French reign, and the sheer drop that, even now, without a single shot being fired at anyone standing at its edge, is enough to make most people take an involuntary step back. It is worth remembering, standing there, that the men who defended that position were not wrong about the physics of the climb. The rock really was that steep. The exposure really was that total. What they failed to account for was never the geometry of the cliff. It was the specific, immovable will of 225 young Americans who had already decided, somewhere on the crossing over from England, that a wall of stone was not going to be the thing that stopped them, and who proved it, foot by bloody foot, until the men watching from above ran out of reasons to believe it couldn't be done.